steadfast and solid, good judgment as we've wrestled with some very tough issues. I would yield the floor.
Alabama.
The Republican leader.
For his kind words, and commend him for the great job he's been doing in outlining the issues before us, not to mention the particular nominee that he was talking about. You know, Mr. President, a few weeks ago, the Obama administration essentially declared that it had met its goals of fixing the Obamacare website. And with the website fixed, they led us to assume that Obamacare was fixed as well. But that was never true. As I've been saying all along, the problems here are much, much bigger than a website. And even the administration's claims about the website have been exaggerated. Recent news reports suggest that many Americans who thought they had enrolled on the exchanges will find that they do not in fact have coverage on January 1st, largely as a result of lingering problems with the site. An even larger problem lies with the coverage options folks are actually finding if they manage to make it through the website. For folks patient enough to successfully navigate through healthcare.gov, many are finding that Obamacare offers higher premiums, higher costs, or deductibles, sometimes all three, in exchange for coverage that is, in many cases, inferior to what they had before. Fewer choices, restricted hospital networks, losing doctors our constituents know and trust. That's what many are getting in exchange for higher costs and skyrocketing premiums, even after the President promised that Obamacare would, quote, cut costs and make coverage more affordable for families and for small businesses, end quote. Despite the President's serial pledges to the contrary, the government's own studies on this issue now indicate that Obamacare will actually increase the cost of health care in America by more than $620 billion. Obamacare will actually increase the cost of health care in America by more than $620 billion. As one California woman recently put it, for her, Obamacare has meant being forced into lower coverage for more money. Many Kentuckians feel exactly the same way. Giselle Martino is a constituent of mine from Prospect, Kentucky. Here's what she recently wrote to me after losing her coverage. I paid a very high premium to have a major medical plan. I'm now forced into the exchange for a lesser plan with more exclusions and higher deductibles. I will most likely never reach those deductibles. How does this help me? I'm basically paying into the plan for the others. If I must pay for my higher tier heart drugs anyway, why should I bother with the health plan? What a disappointment this administration has caused. Higher costs and less care, that's what Obamacare means for Giselle Martino. Obamacare has been a disappointment for Mike Kahn from Prestonsburg, too. Here's what he had to say about this law. A policy that has similar coverage to what we had would cost us around $1,100 a month. That's a 100% increase for me and my wife. I was informed by the individual that was helping me find coverage that it was because we live in eastern Kentucky. Mike said his plan is no longer available in that part of the state, and now he's evidently facing a 100% increase in cost because of where he lives. A 100% increase in cost because of where he lives. It's not fair. Mike and Giselle both have every right to be upset. But that's the reality of Obamacare for too many Kentuckians, a state where 280,000 people have already lost the coverage they had because of this law. It's a reality facing millions of Americans across our country. And when the White House was asked today if they were confident that the millions of Americans with canceled policies would be able to sign up for new insurance before January 1st, they couldn't give a straight answer. That's why Republicans are going to maintain our focus where it belongs, on the people we represent, on the issues that truly matter to them. Because our constituents understand that Obamacare is about so much more than just a website. The administration needs to start understanding that, too. Fixing a few lines of code isn't going to help people keep the plans they like, plans that work for their families. It isn't going to help our constituents afford the law's exorbitant premiums and deductibles. It isn't going to help our constituents cope with fewer choices and lower quality of care. These are the things that actually matter to the middle class. So the administration and its allies in Congress can talk until they're hoarse about a website or about nominees or about whatever else they think they can say to distract Americans from the failures of this law, but that ain't going to work. And to the millions of Americans suffering under Obamacare, you should know that Republicans are on your side. We're going to keep fighting for true health reform that lowers costs, for reform that promotes choice and a better quality of care, and we're going to keep fighting against the idea that government knows better than you do when it comes to your family's health care. That's what our constituents expect of us. I know it's what Kentuckians expect, and that's just what Republicans are going to continue to do. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
Senator from Massachusetts.
I ask that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to honor one of the great leaders in the history of Boston. It might seem odd to describe a man who is still with us today, alive and well, as a figure in history. But in the almost 400 years since Boston was founded, a history that is filled with names known across this country, Winthrop, Lowell, Adams, Lodge. In this 400-year history, few have done more for Boston than our mayor, Tom Menino. Looking back at his 20 years in office, it is clear how much Tom Menino has done for our city. Mayor Menino revitalized Boston, From the waterfront and the Innovation District to Dudley Square and Roxbury, Mayor Menino led the resurgence of our neighborhoods, expanded parks and livable spaces, and created a city whose innovative potential is unlimited. Mayor Menino worked for Boston. With firm convictions, he cautioned against predatory lenders, starting the Don't Borrow Trouble long before the Great Recession. With political will and courage, he improved education for all our kids, creating full-day kindergarten and making Boston schools some of the best in the country. With foresight of the next frontiers, he fought for hospitals and scientific research, giving Boston the world's leading healthcare institutions. And with fierce moral clarity, he stood firmly for equality. Equal opportunity for immigrants, equal rights and equal marriage for the LGBT community, equal pay for women. But perhaps most importantly, Mayor Menino has been there for Boston. Now, it's often said that more than 50% of Boston residents have met Mayor Menino personally. I do not believe this is true. I believe the number must be much greater. It seems as if the mayor attends every community event, every potluck dinner, every school play, and every soccer game. From Grove Hall to the North End, Bowdoin to West Roxbury, we know Mayor Menino will be there for us in our moments of greatest triumph. Ribbon cuttings for new buildings and parks, World Series victories, a new Bostonian citizenship, a child's graduation. And we know he will be there for us in our moments of great tragedy, the death of a loved one, terror in Copley Square. Of course, Mayor Menino could not have done it alone. By his side for all these years, he has had Angela Menino. Angela is a devoted wife, mother, and grandmother. To all of us in Boston, she was not just a first lady, but a first friend. Angela championed causes that often went unheralded in the press, supporting women and children, employment and education, and fighting to end homelessness. Today, we thank Angela as well for helping make our city into a warm and thriving community. Almost 400 years ago, on a ship sailing from England to the New World, John Winthrop declared that the new city they would found, Boston, would be a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. And if that experiment, our city, was to succeed, he said, we must be knit together. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our commission and community in the work as members of the same body. For 20 years, Mayor Menino has made Boston into a city that all eyes can see is a model for the country and for the world. And he has succeeded because he knew that all along our fortunes depend on our work together as one people, as one community, as one Boston. On behalf of a grateful people, Tom Menino, we thank you for your hard work, for your service, and most of all, for your dedication to making Boston a better place. Thank you. I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Is it my understanding we're in a quorum call?
Correct.
I ask unanimous consent that it be officiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to speak about an outstanding member of our staff, a friend, and a very special person who will soon leave the Senate after almost 11 years of service with her family to go to Nashville to begin the next exciting phase of their lives. I first met Laura Loeffler when she was a staffer working in Senator Lamar Alexander's front office, answering the phones and greeting visitors. I was in Washington to try to decide, like you, whether running for the United States Senate was something I should consider. Seeing her smiling face and listening to her Tennessee accent certainly made me feel at home. Later, after I decided to run, we became involved in one of the most difficult races in the country in 2006. I was the only new Republican to make it through. Towards the end, with the race nationalized and dealing with all kinds of issues, a whole crew of folks descended upon our office to help us get across the top. One of those was young Laura Loeffler, who helped us in our communications office. I think she was surprised by the fierceness of a campaign like this. She took it all very personally, a sign of someone you want to be at your side. Then came the transition. Laura was the first person to open our office, and she helped us interview people and find our way through the daunting task of opening a new Senate office. When it came down to deciding who would lead our communications office, we'd gotten down to people who had been here and done it for a long time, and Miss Laura Loeffler. She always said that I was concerned about whether she should really be the person, and in fairness, now that she's leaving, I will say I was. She was young. She had never done anything. She had never done this before. Certainly, I had never done this before. And I wondered whether we needed someone who was more seasoned and had different experiences. Without question, hiring Laura to lead our communications office is one of the best decisions I've ever made in my life. I cannot imagine the last 7 years without Laura in our office, and I know the rest of our staff feels the same way. Laura's been instrumental to our office in every way. No doubt she's done an outstanding job as a communications director. I think that every person in our office, those in other offices, the media people throughout the Capitol and throughout Tennessee, would all speak to the fact that she's been a professional, she's been endearing, and a responsible communications director. But she's also been instrumental in other ways, like always ensuring that I've never forgotten where I came from. She has that knack when we're making a decision over a tough vote, to slip in towards the end and sit down privately and express her own feelings, something I value greatly. As time went on, I realized something was different about other Senate offices. Most Senate offices center around the United States Senator. Our office has never been that way. It's always revolved around Laura. It began with this guy named John Herzog, whom she later married. Was he going to end up having the kind of job that would allow him to know he could support a family? And then when he did, was he going to ask her to marry him? This went on for months and months. Then there was a wedding after he asked. I don't think I've ever seen so many photographs of dresses and flower arrangements, nor of others in our office. Then came the decision about their home purchase. Where would it be? What would it look like? How far of a drive would it be? You know the drill. Then came young Jack. His hair was so perfect when he was born, he instantly was dubbed the weatherman. Then, of course, which daycare would he attend? Would it be close enough? Would she continue to be a communications director and a good mom? And as we all know would be the case, she has been exceptional at both. And then more of the same in Tennessee. I remember a town hall meeting in Loudon, Tennessee, where over 1,000 people showed up at the gymnasium, a place where Laura Loeffler had been the valedictorian. I remember walking in with such excitement that so many people would be there at this town hall meeting to hear me discuss the big issues facing our nation. But not surprisingly, the first thing that was said when I walked in the door was, "Where's Laura?" Now as we all knew would happen at some point, it is time for them to move on to the next phase in their life. While we've all been a part of her life and lived the ups and downs, she has been a part of all of ours. We will miss her greatly. She knows full well that I would gladly continue to be second fiddle in her office if she would stay. But we all know it's time for her and John, with their wonderful son Jack, and possibly others to come, to go back to Tennessee. Time to go back and be a part of other people's lives the way they have been a part of ours. She has made life better for all of us over the last 7 years. Her big smile and ability to take ribbing and also dish it out has made each day so much more enjoyable. She's a consummate professional, always seeking perfection, but with the ability to make it fun along the way. We will miss her, but we are so happy for her, for John, and for Jack. We are happy for her mother, who lives just across the line in Kentucky, and her dad, who lives right up the road in Loudon. We know Nashville will be a much, much better place with the Herzogs there. We look forward to visiting them often, and we all hope they will continue to involve us all in their wonderful life, their story, and the evolution of the Herzog family in Tennessee. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, I rise to speak as if in morning business for approximately 10 minutes.
Senator is recognized.
Mr. President, I come to the floor today to urge my colleagues to support the bipartisan budget agreement. I want to congratulate our colleagues, especially Budget Committee Chairwoman Murray, for her outstanding leadership in forging this bipartisan agreement with her House counterpart, Mr. Ryan. They reached this agreement in a way that is indeed a compromise, not everyone's desired outcome, but a fair and necessary one. I urge my colleagues to support it. I think it's fantastic that they actually got a budget done. This is the first time in several years that we're actually going to vote on a bipartisan budget conference agreement. And I think it bodes well for future activity where we will return to the due order of passing legislation, one in each house, a conference committee to hammer out the disagreements, and then back to us for final agreement. What I like about this agreement is it creates certainty by avoiding sequester for 2 years, giving the top-line funding to we on the Appropriations Committee for 2014 and 2015. Many people do not realize that we on the Appropriations Committee, that actually puts money in the federal checkbook to be spent, have a cap put on our spending by the Budget Committee. That's called the 302A, or the top line. We have not been able to do our Appropriations Committee because we haven't had a top line. This enables us to have one for 2014. We are under a mandate to bring it back to the Senate and to the House by January 14th. We will meet that deadline. It's going to be tough. It's going to be stringent, but we're going to get the job done. It also gives us certainty for 2015 so we can return to a regular order of actually knowing where we stand with our cap, holding our hearings, and bringing bills to the committee. The other thing that I like about this agreement, this bipartisan budget agreement, is it prevents harm. It protects seniors and families. It preserves the social safety net like Medicare and Social Security. And finally, the agreement ends gridlock. The American people are tired of shut down, slow down, slam down politics. This agreement ends the lurching from crisis to crisis and shows we can compromise and that we can govern. First of all and foremost, this budget agreement creates certainty for America's business and families. By avoiding sequester for 2 years, it prevents further across-the-board cuts. Not that we don't need strategic cuts, and we will come up with them in the Appropriations Committee, but across-the-board cuts where you don't know if a program works or a program is dysfunctional. This way we can actually look at those programs that we do need to cut, those that are dated, those that are duplicative, those that are dysfunctional. Sure, let's cut those. But at the same time, let's keep the good programs and make sure that they're adequately funded. I believe that by avoiding sequester and the meat axe approach to cuts really helps us have better governance. We will have a more frugal government, but we'll have a more sensible way of spending. It also gives us this top-line funding for 2014 and 2015 to the Appropriations Committee. It means that we can write an omnibus bill. Now, what does an omnibus bill mean? We on the Appropriations Committee have 12 subcommittees. We would like to have brought these subcommittees up one by one and have had the House exercise their due diligence in looking at the bills to see what they'd want to add, subtract, or change. We couldn't do it. So now we're going to, because we failed to have this budget agreement to give us the top line. What we will now be able to do is for 2014 be able to bring them all up at one time in a bill called the Omnibus. And I hope it's a bus that really moves. It will enable us to make smart choices about investments in America instead of government on autopilot through a continuing funding resolution. This agreement saves America from lurching from one continuing resolution, funding resolution to another. And it's a fair compromise. For 2014, it's $45 billion above the House proposed budget, but it's $45 billion below the Senate proposed budget. Our budget leadership met in the middle and really saw that that would be an adequate compromise. It is, I would have preferred the 1058 level, but it's adequate. The bipartisan agreement also, as I said, prevents harm to the middle class. What I think America is looking for, though, is not only numbers and programs and so on. They want us to get our act together. They want us to really do our job and do it in a way that's sensible and civil. And I believe that that's what was done in that Budget Committee. They want us to work together across the aisle and across the dome. This bipartisan agreement shows what could be done when we do meet in the middle to make progress for the middle class and for those people who are neither right or left but want to take the middle of the road. Now, this compromise is not perfect, and compromises never are. For me, some of the pay-fors were not exactly what I was happy about, but for example, it requires new federal employees to pay more for their retirement and working-age military retirees to receive smaller COLAs. I would have preferred an agreement that closed tax loopholes or canceled some of those out-of-date farm subsidies left over from the 1930s. However, by avoiding sequester, we also will be able to avoid furloughs. Now, if you talk to the civilian employees at Defense and you talk to the federal employees and the domestic agencies, this whole idea of furloughs and sequesters, some of them have had a double furlough. Like at the FBI, we were facing furloughs at the FBI. We didn't have gas for the FBI cars. That's just not right. We want to make sure we continue to fund our government and meet our responsibility. I cannot stress enough how important this bipartisan agreement is. If we continued the path that we were, and if sequester was left in place, it will cost our economy 800,000 jobs. In 1 year, 800,000 jobs. Maryland already lost $21,000 because of sequester. We have important federal agencies. We have over 250,000 contractors, both in defense and civilian agencies, and the ripple effect through my state of its impact on institutions like Johns Hopkins and the University of Maryland, and on major flagship companies like Lockheed Martin were really significant. So by passing this, we have those certainty that enables us to keep those jobs. The Appropriations Committee is ready to write a funding bill that will create jobs today and jobs tomorrow. Jobs today and important investments in infrastructure, education, research and development, and the same in jobs tomorrow. Let's take this bipartisan agreement and we will produce a bill. We on the Appropriations Committee will produce a bill that meets our national security needs, our compelling human needs, and at the same time lay the groundwork for a more prosperous America. So I urge my colleagues to support this bill, end gridlock and deadlock, and let's get on with making sure we have certainty and reliability in funding the government of the United States of America. Mr. President, I yield the floor. And note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Coming up in about 20 minutes from now at 5:30 Eastern Time, votes on a couple of nominees, including Ann Patterson to be Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs and Jeh Johnson to head the Homeland Security Department. Again, that's at 5:30 Eastern. A federal judge said today that the National Security Agency's bulk collection of phone records violates the Constitution's ban of unreasonable searches. The judge granted a preliminary injunction, including that the two plaintiffs in the case were likely to be able to show that their privacy interests outweigh the government's interest in collecting the data. Senator Patrick Leahy, chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, released a statement about the ruling, saying in part, Americans deserve an open and transparent debate about the constitutionality, efficacy, and appropriateness of the government's dragnet collection programs. I welcome today's district court ruling regarding the collection of phone metadata, particularly because the litigants were afforded the opportunity to participate in an adversarial process. That part of a statement from Senator Leahy. Here on C-SPAN, we've covered a number of the hearings and events about the NSA's data collection program, including hearings by the Senate Judiciary Committee, which you can see at our video library at cspan.org.
President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I would ask that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, in 12 days, unemployment insurance will expire for 1.3 million Americans. This will impact virtually every state. And over the course of the next year, it will set back millions of hard-working families, slow down job growth, and retard our economic recovery. Today, I filed 3 amendments to the Bipartisan Budget Agreement Act. The amendments would extend UI for 1 month, 3 months, or a year, respectively. And while I believe the best policy is to extend unemployment insurance for 1 year in order to keep our economic recovery moving forward, I'm willing to work with my colleagues who objected to extending it for the full year to find a path forward. But we must, I think, provide at least a message to those people that they will not see their benefits eliminated on December 28th. That we will, in fact, be working to make sure that this protection is in place for families all across this country. Over the next several days, I'll be coming to the floor seeking consent and urging my colleagues to extend unemployment insurance. The expiration of unemployment insurance will be devastating to families across the entire nation who rely on this as really the last remaining source of support in many cases for people who've worked hard for many, many years and because of this economy has lost their jobs. This is a stressful time. My home state of Rhode Island has an unemployment rate of 9.2%. We have been struggling since 2008 and 2009. This is very difficult for people, and this difficulty will be particularly hard to bear as we celebrate the holidays, a time when people should be able to consider and count their blessings. They'll instead be looking ahead a few days afterwards to the loss of valuable, irreplaceable income in many respects. And it's also a devastating blow to our local businesses and economy. This is not just doing the right thing for American families. This is doing the right and smart thing for the American economy. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that if we fail to extend unemployment insurance, we will lose 200,000 jobs at a time that our major priority should be getting as many jobs as we can. And will slow economic growth by about 0.2% GDP. So this is not only the right thing to do in terms of the Families of America, it's the smart and right thing to do for our economy. There is a compelling economic rationale to provide these extended unemployment insurance benefits. Mark Zandi, a noted economist, estimates that for every dollar that we put into the UI program, we get about $1.70 or $1.60 in return in terms of economic activity. And it makes sense. People who are living without their source of income, when they take this money, they go to the store. They put food on the table. They pay rent. They pay heat up in the Northeast where the President pro temp resides. They're not stashing it away. They're putting it right back in the economy with other money they have, in some cases. And as a result, this is a wise economic policy as well as humane and decent policy. Now is not the time to let this program expire for individuals or for the economy. We have to extend UI immediately. December 28th is the day. It stops. It's a cliff. People are off the program. And then, throughout the year, as people exhaust their state benefits of 26 weeks, they fall off because there's no unemployment insurance program. And this is an economy where we're just beginning to see some recovery. Last month's numbers suggested about a 200,000 job gain. That was good, but hidden in those statistics was increasing evidence that long-term unemployment is increasing. Those people who haven't found jobs quickly are not finding jobs very well at all. That trend is continuing, and that is another reason why we need long-term benefits that are provided by the federal program. Now, I'm going to do my best to try to bring people together to recognize that this is an issue that is about American workers. You don't get unemployment insurance unless you've worked. It's about American families because it's so necessary to support these families. And it's about states all across this country. Rhode Island has a 9.2% unemployment record. Nevada is the highest, about 9.3%. But you can look at states in many parts of this country, not north, south, east, west, scattered across this country, that have unemployment rates over 8%, that need this program for their residents. And so I hope we can come together and work together and get this done. And I would urge again in the next few days that we all stop and think about our obligations not only to the families of America, but to keeping the momentum of economic growth moving forward. And I would particularly ask those colleagues who are representing states with unemployment rates that are above the national average, and the national average is roughly 7%, to think very, very hard what they're going to tell many of their constituents on December 28th when they've lost their benefits. With that, Mr. President, I would note the absolute quorum and yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator from Indiana.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the call of the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I know we're going to be voting shortly. I think the narrative out of the White House is that this health care plan is starting to work. That's not what I'm hearing from back home, and I think many are questioning this. Wall Street Journal today published an analysis showing how the health care law will raise premium rates. We all are familiar with the President's promise that rates won't increase under the Obamacare Affordable Care Act. According to the Wall Street Journal, Americans, particularly young, healthy adults, could see, and I'm quoting here, could see insurance rates double or even triple as they look to buy individual coverage. Another group, Oliver Wyman, Price Waterhouse Coopers, and Milliman, all issued reports estimating that Obamacare would increase premiums by up to 60%. So on and on this drama goes, with broken promises and the American people learning and discovering now that the promises that were made when this law was passed and all through the 3.5 years leading up to where we are, assurances coming out of the President and the White House that don't worry, your premiums won't go up, period. You can keep the doctor that you have, period. This is not going to cost any more money, period. Those promises have been broken, and Hoosiers are finding out about this every day. So regardless of the statements coming out that don't worry, everything's going to be okay, sort of take it to the bank, trust us, that's not what is happening on the ground. And people are writing to me, they're calling to our office, they're tweeting, they're emailing, they're doing everything they can to give us these horror stories and saying, do I really have to do this? Unfortunately, they do. Edward from Chesterton, Indiana, for instance, said he has spent countless hours on healthcare.gov searching for a health care plan. He discovered that the plans offered on the Obamacare exchange had expensive premiums that he hadn't anticipated. In order to afford the monthly premiums, he has to choose a plan for his family with unaffordable deductibles in order to keep his premiums at the level that he can afford to pay. So it's basically, Edward, don't get sick. Don't have a medical expense throughout your family every year and you'll be okay. But if you do, what you didn't pay in premiums, you're going to have to pay in much, much higher deductibles. John from Martinsville, Indiana, was finally able to get on the Healthcare.gov website, he said, and he found a Browns plan that was going to be at least $100 more per month. He doesn't qualify for a government subsidy, and he doesn't see any way this new law will be saving money for his family. John says the only thing he sees is that he now will be subsidizing the health care system even more than before the law was passed. Dwayne from Shipshewana, Indiana, wrote in to tell me that not only is the small group health insurance plan his business currently offers not available any longer in 2014, starting in 2014, but in his 15 years of administering the business health plans, he said he's never seen a rate increase this high. Dwayne's health insurance plan for he and his business employees will increase 65% in this coming year. Dwayne's small group health insurance is increasing 65%. And this is called the Affordable Health Care Act. Well, let me give you one more broken promise. William from Granger, Indiana, wrote in to tell me that his wife, who works as a part-time nurse, will no longer be offered health care since she works part-time. I assume kids at home, or maybe the hospital has determined that they want to stay under that 40-hour work week level, so they put her on part-time. I'm not exactly sure what the case is. In any event, they discovered that they will now have premiums rise from $11,544 a year under their current plan to $19,076 per year, an increase of over $7,500. He goes on to say, and I quote, "Well, so much for the President's promise. If you like your plan, if you like your doctor, your costs will go down by $2,500. Williams' costs go up by $7,500. Look, this isn't just Republicans in Washington highlighting these health care costs. These are Hoosiers from all backgrounds, Republicans, Democrats, from all walks of life, sharing their stories with me about how they're paying the price for the President's broken promises. Mr. President, I yield the floor. Absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Senate expected to start votes momentarily on a couple of nominations. Ann Patterson to be Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, and also Jeh Johnson to head the Homeland Security Department. Majority Leader Reid said those votes earlier today. He said those votes would happen at about 5:30 Eastern Time, a couple minutes from now. Quickly wanted to give you an update. The House Ethics Committee plans to formally investigate Representative Trey Raydell following his arrest and guilty plea for cocaine possession. The Washington Post writes that a panel of lawmakers led by Representatives Charlie Dent and Yvette Clark will determine whether Raydell violated the House Code of Conduct or broke any other laws or regulations related to his responsibilities as a lawmaker. Raydell, who is 37, pleaded guilty on November 20th to a misdemeanor drug possession charge in D.C. Superior Court. And that in the Washington Post.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection. Morning business is closed. Under previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to consider the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination: Ann W. Patterson of Virginia, a career member of the Senior Foreign Service, to be ambassador.
Under the previous order, all post-cloture time has expired, and the question occurs on the nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Beckich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller. Hey, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Burr, Cantwell, Reed of Rhode Island, and Udall of New Mexico. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso and Crapo. Ms. Mikulski? Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Isaacson? Mr. Isaacson, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Johans, no. Mr. Coates, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Corker, aye. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Rono, aye. Mr. Cochran, aye. Mr. Johnson, South Dakota, aye. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Mr. Leahy? Aye. Mr. Bozeman? Aye. Mr. Wyden? Aye. Mr. Wyden? Aye. Mr. Coburn? No. Mr. Kane? Aye. Ms. Heitkamp?
Yeah.
Aye.
We'd have to get someone else to do it. But,
Ms. Baldwin?
I'm just
Aye.
bigger picture, you know.
Mr. Reed of Nevada? Aye. Mr. Enzi? No. Mr. Cardin? Aye. Mr. Schumer? Mr. Schumer? Aye. Mr. Warner? Aye. Mr. Don?